You got to seize those opportunities because Hikaru Nakamura takes the win, and now he's bounced back from that. And we've been talking about how good he is at doing that. Bouncing back, he's right back in this with that 2-point lead and the white pieces. But Denis, you can look back on this game as a big missed opportunity.
For sure. Denis won, an earlier game, we saw Hikaru, he lost. There's a couple moments in the game against Alireza where he lost a string of games. Denis is going to need streaks to take down Hikaru. He's going to have to really frustrate him over multiple games. Just didn't get opportunities that game. That was tough. And we have another Spanish structure so far.
Yeah, he's actually, the only difference really is that A takes B5 has just not been included. Otherwise, we're kind of in the same position that we saw before. Interesting not to include that because I thought it really only favored white, but there's really no big difference here. You can throw in A takes B5 at any point. The one thing is that the move D4 has come a little bit earlier than last time.
Yeah, and like in the previous game, Denis did get a good position and ended up winning the game with the time mishap. So otherwise, you might be asking, Denis, he's down a few games as black does need to spice things up. Against E4, if you want to do that, you might be playing the Sicilian. But because he had success earlier with the Spanish here, he's ready to repeat.
Yeah, bishop E3. At this point, we have seen the more symmetrical capture from Denis. That's C takes on D4. You were suggesting perhaps E takes D4.
Definitely.
And that, again, was on the table. But no, keeping it more solid here, the extra space and the bishop on B3. Just compare the bishops for white to those in black's position. Slightly better. And, of course, with D4, just that extra central control.
Extra center control. And you're wondering, well, do you take on D4? You can take on D4, but the risk there is that D6 pawn becomes very soft. Black would rather white take on E5, recapture the pawn. Symmetrical, much more equal-like position.
Yeah, really in this position, you want to continue development. That's queen D2, getting the queen off the first rank so the rooks are connected. For black, the same thing. However, there's less space in the position. It feels like a concept, space. How do you really define it? Why does it contribute to an advantage? Well, here, the black queen, if it goes to C7, there's rook C1. White can just choose to play queen D2, stay on the D file, which is currently closed. There's no pressure on it. Whereas black has to make that choice. Queen E7 might put the queen a little bit too far away from the action.
And when you have more space, you want to keep the pieces on the board. When you have less, because less space, fewer squares for your pieces. Denis eventually is like, you know what, I have to trade. I'm getting cramped. But the main drawback here, long-term, D6 isolated pawn.
That's right. The D6 pawn is weak. E4, however, is now on a semi-open file, so the rook on E8 is putting pressure. Bishop takes D4. Given a miss by the computer there, probably looking for knight takes D4 instead, but understandably not played by Hikaru because the E4 pawn was under some kind of attack there, so it's more of a tactical solution. But bishop takes D4 is the more logical move, keeps everything defended, and it's really the D6 pawn versus the E4 pawn. Which one is more of a weakness?
Well, if white has time, at some point this knight vacates, you play F3, you're like, I can stabilize my pawn, whereas black can't stabilize their D6 pawn.
Interesting. Allowing knight takes F3 with check to double the pawns there. That's a decision that really shows that Hikaru was willing to take the structure. It says, well, even though the H3 pawn is attacked, the D6 pawn is something that's going to be so weak, and in this case, worth handing over H3 in order to take D6, says Hikaru.
I'm a little surprised by that. I thought he might play king G2 and just, H3 can be defended, D6 also defended, but he can just keep applying pressure, whereas after king G2, black can add additional pieces on H3. So I'm a little surprised by that decision. Still prefer white's chances, but more liquidations. Denis is generally pretty comfortable in these technical endgames.
Yeah, let's see here, because this is, a position that really is trending towards equality. However, it's these types of positions that I have felt both players capable of those slow incremental gains and outplaying the opposition. In this case, it does feel that Hikaru is trying to be the one to do that. Queen takes on D6. If you capture it, you help white double the rooks. And you also have to watch out this bishop on H3. If it gets attacked, king H2 in the future, it doesn't have great squares to move to. E6 is probably the destination, but D7 is not ideal, and E6 does ruin the pawn structure a little bit, although I think that's probably what's going to happen.
And we have to talk about the pawns. Black has the H pawn, a passed H pawn. White has doubled F pawns, which means white has potential to strengthen the center, push the pieces back, but that's double-edged. That could favor either side.
Yeah, in terms of maybe the next couple of moves, 5 to 10 moves, I think white's pawns advancing might be the difference. You trade a bunch of pieces, you go to an endgame, all of a sudden it's black's h-pawn that will win it. So different positions where each of these pawn structures will thrive.
I wouldn't be surprised to see one rook traded off, not both rooks. You want to keep at least one on for some winning chances. Because if you play rook back to d6, we're expecting rook d8.
Yep, at that point, that would make the most sense. I thought that we might see the rooks double after rook to d8 the first time. So if he wants to play on, he could consider rook back to d6 and double. Or you could take on b8, because when black takes back, the rook on b8 is not ideal. And if you play rook a8, rook c8, the bishop and pawn for white on the queen side have the entry squares covered. c4, c3, c2, they're all covered. Same on the a file. And that means that white could maybe shift to the d file with rook d1.
Yeah, you're probably playing rook d1 and not rook c1, because rook c1 can be met by rook c8.
That's right. Yeah, challenging the c file. Even though rook d1 can't quite get into d7, still it's the main open file that white can control. So kind of a big decision here. How do you push for something? First of all, do you want to push this position further? Repetition's available, rook d1 as well.
I think white should definitely try. Hikaru is a big fighter. Double the rooks. At some point, I really want to play f4 and e5.
And he can still play a different move here, although rook d6 would be that repetition invitation. In moments like this, you also have to weigh the clock. It's part of your decision on how ambitious you'd like to be.
If there's a repetition, it means Hikaru's not that happy with his position, because he does like to provoke mistakes, very comfortable playing endgames, where at least there's some ideas of how to put pressure, how to gain space, and I think I see that. I mean, the one concern maybe for Hikaru is he sees the potential of bishop e6. Yes, I'm not sure, like, that does weaken the pawn for black, but this is a very good bishop on b3.
That's right. And rook a1, the difference from rook d1 is we're directly planning to play rook a7. That will pressure the f7 pawn, and there's more happening for white. Black needs to react before looking for counterplay. The bishop on h3, it's just not a great piece. It will need to come back into the action. Bishop e6 looks like it will be forced either now or on the next move, and that makes sense. If you capture, the f-pawn takes. While it ruins the pawn structure, it also controls f5, so it's not the worst.
And because it controls f5, we need to reroute this knight. This knight needs to join in the game to put any sort of pressure on e6 or b5. Doesn't have h5, so I'm expecting, okay, a nice little check, force the king on a worse square. Maybe knight e2, knight f4.
That makes sense.
Lots of ways to go wrong for either side here, but we have to favor the active side, which is white.
Yeah, currently the rook on b8 just does not compare to the rook on a7. While this is not the biggest advantage, still the king's cut off for black. White's king can just walk into the center of the board at its leisure, and the knight maneuvering from g3 back to e2 might provoke e5, and then perhaps knight c3, or perhaps knight back to g3. You can just continue to fight for some squares here. Instead, he's gone for f4. The idea could be e5 and f5 directly.
There's a big decision here for black. Do you keep the rook on b8, which is considered passive defense, or do you shift it over? You might lose the b pawn, but you can use your rook maybe to attack white's central pawns.
Yeah, I think the idea is e5 and f5. You don't want that f pawn to be a target. f5 played immediately. This is going to undouble the pawns. The e pawn's a little scary, and if the knight jumps in f5, suddenly knight d6, g7's a target. You can't play g6 because the h pawn is a target. This is a small push here from Hikaru, trying to apply the pressure and also realizing that the clock is ticking.
And it's very useful for white. There's no mating nets. It's not like knight f4, the king always has h2. If you flush the king out, that might even help white. Might even walk towards the center and escort those pawns down the board. Definitely favor, even if you see the bar and it's like, seems pretty equal. This is much easier to play for white, and that's why Denis is falling behind on the clock.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, after pawn takes on f5, knight takes f5, maybe something like
f5 is tough to take. Like rook
really
c7, because inviting the knight into the game feels like a mistake.
Yeah, at this point, you are in a tough spot. Rook c6, defense, definitely one of the best moves in the position. Rook d7, a counter, undermining the knight. And now we see knight f4. This will be a very impressive hold if Denis can manage it.
He is managing it so far. Hikaru doesn't want to take on e6, wants to wait for e takes f5.
And he's definitely missed that one, rook c4. It's not the biggest deal, but this is an important move. It defends the knight on f4, and if you trade, suddenly that outside h-pawn that we were talking about, it starts to matter.
Yeah, black's definitely activated without giving up additional threats. Time is the main concern for Denis here, and Hikaru wants to continue threats, find a way for Denis to break.
Important decision here because now you
F2
might,
is loose.
Yeah, you might start to feel that rook
F2 and
d8
B2, this is decision time.
I think going for a repetition here is not the worst. It's gotten out of hand a little bit compared to the previous position.
Well, how do we play on? Take on B5?
Yeah, I think this is a fair decision from Hikaru. He's not happy with it.
No.
He wanted a lot more from that position, but a big credit